Good evening. Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to join you all here this evening to talk with my friend, producer, and colleague and mentor, Anne Hamburger, and to talk about the power of persistence. A quick procedural note before we get into it. If you have any questions during the broadcast, please just enter your questions in the chat and we'll get to them in the Q&A at the end. So Annie is a producer, a writer, and the founder of a New York-based theater company called Garde Arts. She is a force of nature and a cultural entrepreneur. She's also relentlessly creative, resourceful, driven, idealistic, and a very loving mama bear. I started hearing about Annie in the early 1980s, nearly a year before I actually met her. I was working at the Brooklyn Academy of Music and thinking about starting a theater company myself. But everybody I spoke to said, oh, you should meet Annie Hamburger. So Annie had just left BAM and had determined that she was going to launch New York City's first site-specific theater company. So of course, I chased her down and I went to her apartment, and within minutes, really, I was working for her and spent years together with her getting Garde Arts off the ground. Annie saw every inch of New York City and all of its complexity as a source of inspiration, as a potential theater. And she wanted to be the person who made it possible for artists just at the very beginning of their careers to unleash their imaginations on this vast and exhilarating stage. We had no money, virtually none, and precious few prospects at the beginning, but that didn't deter her one bit. So Annie, let's talk about those early days. What motivated you to take on this enormous challenge?
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be speaking to you today. I founded Garde Arts in 1985 as my third-year thesis project at Yale. And the reason why I wanted to do site-specific theater is I felt that by using the streets and buildings and landmarks of New York City as our stage, we could really be reaching far more people than we could inside a conventional theater. And so I was very excited to begin to launch Garde Arts. And with that, let's go to the first slide. There is a reason why we called this conversation that we're having the power of persistence, because having a lifelong career in the arts is not easy. And there's lots of obstacles. There's lots of people who want to talk you out of it. But if you're persistent and you believe in what you're doing, you can make it happen.
So Annie, let's talk a little bit about what kind of work you were doing at the very beginning. Site-specific theater didn't even exist as an idea in New York at the time. How did you introduce the city to this idea?
The very first show I did was called Naked Chambers. And if you're wondering what this picture is, you're looking at the 23rd floor of a skyscraper in New York City. And that is a real person. That is a mountain climber who's scaling down the side of a building. And the playwright I worked with wrote a story about a mountain climber who's also an art thief. And the art thief is going in and out of people's apartments, stealing their art. And so the piece consisted of this mountain climber, and the real estate developer made me sign a contract saying he wasn't responsible if the guy fell, but the guy had climbed 10,000, 20,000 foot peaks. So for him to be on top of a roof climbing down a building was no big deal. And then there were actors in each of the windows who were performing scenes. The very, very first show we did, and we had 35 chairs in the street, which we closed off, where we had the music, Carmina Burana playing. I was thrilled. It was really dramatic and quite wonderful.
And I remember just at the time that, in addition to these 35 people who were sitting in chairs facing this building, passersby just were drawn by the spectacle of something like this happening in their neighborhoods.
So let's go to the next slide. So En Garde Arts is the name of my company, and the reason why I called it En Garde Arts is because in French it means get ready. And I want people who see our work to do just that, to get ready and to experience work that's surprising and interesting and accessible.
And you did this as a thesis project at Yale. Were your teachers and classmates, were they encouraging? I mean, did they believe it was something that the city needed in its cultural landscape?
No.
So what did they say when you presented the idea?
Everyone was like, you cannot do this. It's never going to work. You need a building. People want to identify with a building. And the chairman of my department at Yale said, I just want you to know, if you're not successful starting a theater, you'll still get your Master's of Fine Art. When you're determined, you don't listen to the no's, because when you're inventing something new, there are many people who will say no to you, and you just have to not take no for an answer and don't quit. And I would say over the course of my 38 years of producing, I've probably wanted to quit maybe 38 times, but I haven't.
I would imagine too that in the beginning, when you were thinking about how to do this work, that you might have thought, well, if we don't have a building, if we don't have a theater to pay the bills for, to pay for the lighting and the rent, that it might be cheaper. But I know, because I was there, it still was quite an enormous financial challenge. I mean, we had 3 jobs, each one of us at the time, right? So.
Well, we did. And I do want to say to everyone, because I want to make sure that you know who this wonderful woman is who's moderating this talk. Portia started En Garde Arts with me, and she's a producer in her own right. She's fearless in her own right. And when you have a partner in any endeavor that you do, you should always look at, you have certain strengths, and you really want to work with someone else who has different but complementary strengths. Someone who you can grow to care about with and communicate well with, and who understands what you're trying to do. And Portia was and is still that person. I don't believe that I could have started En Garde Arts without her support and vision and determination and courage. It's true. So, it's just to remember that in moving things forward, what one needs is a family of friends, a family of supporters, and a family of people who have common visions, who you can communicate both the good and the bad with. Next slide.
I have to say that on top of that, it was really that you were laser focused, Annie. And you need that kind of tenacity and determination, because it's not like there are people waiting in line to fund this work, these crazy ideas that we have as creative people. The funding for this kind of work is super competitive, and you have to prove yourself and prove that your idea is good before you can get any of it. But you persisted. You managed to capture enough funding to launch one of your early shows, which is also really served to put site-specific theater on the map. In fact, I remember that's what the New York Times Review said. With Bad Penny, Annie Hamburger put site-specific theater on the map. I'm remembering that right, aren't I?
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about Bad Penny, which is obviously the image in this slide.
Yeah, so Bad Penny was a show that we did by a wonderfully gifted writer named Mac Wellman in Central Park. And for those of you that don't know, Central Park is a major park in New York City. There are many rules and limitations, but we wanted to make this a great piece of theater for all New Yorkers. And the story of Bad Penny is that 2 New Yorkers meet on a park bench, and they are polar opposites from one another. She's an optimist and he's a pessimist. And Portia, why is he a pessimist?
because on his way to the park, he's picked up a bad penny, which there's a superstition that if you pick up a penny and it's coins have head and tails, and if it's tails side up, that's a bad penny. But he picked it up anyway, and so now he's going to be cursed with bad luck for the rest of his life. And the optimist in this play, the woman he meets, is trying to convince him that this isn't possible, but it's written in such beautifully poetic language, and it's a piece of theater that was full of surprises, right, Annie?
Yes. Well, what was kind of funny is, given that it was in a public space, we would have people who imagined they were also in the play, and they would start speaking. And you can't see the bridge that's right outside of the frame of this picture. The bridge is called the Bow Bridge. And so the actors were on this side of the lake, the other side of the lake, in that rowboat, and also up on the bridge. And so as they're performing, there were other people who decided they were going to be performing too. So you couldn't really tell who was an actor and who was a self-proclaimed actor.
And some of the actors wore body mics and were amplified, and some of the actors weren't. So there was a real element of surprise to the audience. I mean, honestly, you could tell by the language, because, as I said, it was a really beautifully written play. It wasn't without its challenges, though, right, Annie? I mean,
no. I mean, site-specific theater is not easier than being
right.
easier, where there's lights and sound and a roof over your head and it doesn't rain. So let's go to the next slide.
Well, I just want to mention before we go into that penny won a bunch of awards in New York City, and on the back of that, I brought it to New York. It played in London at the London International Festival of Theatre, and it really, as I said, it put On Garde Arts on the map. And Annie was emboldened by this success, and took that energy and went in search of finding the most exciting young theater makers working in America at that time, which leads us to Reza.
So I was very, very fortunate to meet Reza on a trip that I made to California, because one of the other things about a long-lasting career is the art. I'm a creative producer, and the artists that I choose to work with need to be exceptional and have a true vision for doing something different. And Reza Abdo was a director that was truly exceptional. This is for sure one of the most difficult pieces I ever did. This picture is pre-digital age, so it's hard to see what it is, but this is a 120-foot table, which, for those of you that don't work in feet, I'll just say it was long. And it was in the middle of the street. It ran down the street. The audience was sitting around the table. There were actors on top of the table, but this was only one of 16 scenes that took place over 4 square blocks of the neighborhood, with 60 performers and a marching band.
And a red Cadillac driving around. I mean, it was crazy.
And it was challenging too. There were many characters in the neighborhood, and we had to endear ourselves to all of them in order to make all of this happen. And that's the police department, the fire department, the buildings department, the neighbors who lived there, the businesses that worked there. There was a lot of handshaking and conversations to get people to be supportive of this. We sold tickets off the top of my car, and it ran for 4 weeks. Sometimes it rained and we had to close the show down. Sometimes it didn't, but it was extremely, extremely gratifying.
And keep in mind, at the end of every performance, we had to shut down and take away all of the sets and costumes and store everything, and then rebuild it the next night before the next show. So it was an incredibly labor-intensive show. But like Bad Penny, Father Was a Peculiar Man, the name of the show, created and directed by Reza Abdo, really somehow captured the zeitgeist of what was happening in New York City at the time. And people who saw that show back in the day still remember it and are still talking about it today. In fact, Annie, isn't there a museum exhibition or something happening about
there's an exhibition of his work that's going around the world, and there's also a book about Reza Abdoh's work. And there's a film that was recently made, now a documentary film.
So it was a really, I've never ever in my life seen a piece of theater like Father Was a Peculiar Man, and it's something to be exceptionally proud of. And I'm sure a lot of people, myself included, wonder what is she going to do next after this exceptionally unique and incredibly exhausting effort.
These are just two of the shows that I did over a 13-year period. Well, during that 13-year period, I got married. I had kids. I had twins, as a matter of fact. Over the course of my career as a woman, I've heard people say to me, you can't have a creative career and also have a family. And I'm here to tell you that it's absolutely not true. And while it's always a juggling act to be a creative person and to be a mom and to be a wife, I forgot my husband. It's very important, you know, for me, I'm very gratified that I have all of those things to enrich my life. But frankly, I saw New York City changing. I saw a lot of the empty spaces being bought up and turned into party spaces and ripped down, and apartment buildings were being put up. And also, I was tired.
Understandably.
In the United States, it's very hard to raise the money for your show. It's a very different system. Money comes from foundations and individual philanthropy and some corporations. And it just was very difficult for me to raise the money for the shows and to be a mom. And I kind of felt like I needed a change. And so one day, next slide, please. I got a call, and the call was from Disney. And Disney said, would you like to come in and interview to found and run a global division, bringing theater artists into the theme parks? And I was so shocked and taken aback. I thought someone was playing a joke on me, but they weren't. And I went in and interviewed, and I actually got the job.
I mean, Disney seemed like, for those of us who know Annie and have worked with Annie and love Annie, Disney seemed like the most unlikely fit for her. None of us believed that she'd do it, but off she went.
Next slide. Just in case all of you don't know Disney, which I'm sure you do. So I was an executive vice president for Walt Disney Parks and Resorts. There were very few executive vice president women, and I had no corporate experience. So I came in at a very, very high level. And it was enticing to me to think about being able to do theatrical work in the parks all over the world, going to Tokyo and going to Hong Kong and going to Paris and learning about these cultures and learning about the different ways that people work was extremely gratifying and rewarding to me, besides the fact I had resources that I couldn't have.
This scrappy theater company where, you know, we're all rolling up our sleeves and doing this amazing work, to being the top of a kind of organizational pyramid where you've got literally, I remember you telling me once you had thousands of employees under that pyramid. So an incredible amount of creative resources, financial resources. So a candy box, right? How did you choose what the first show was that you got to work on, and tell us what it was like to play with all that?
Next slide, please. So the first show I did was a major show in a 2,000-seat theater in California. And it was an adaptation of the film Aladdin. Francesca Zambello is a world-class opera director, and I brought in world-class designers, and we broke all the rules. as I told you, I am not somebody who follows the rules when I don't feel they make sense. And I'll give you an example. Theme park shows are never longer than 30 minutes. Aladdin was 47 minutes. We brought in professional actors. There were 60 people in the chorus.
Wow, that must have been amazing.
I
So,
think one of the things I'm most proud of, though, about Aladdin, when we did auditions, we had a quadriplegic woman come in who auditioned in a wheelchair, who sang like a bird. And we decided that we were going to hire her and put her in the chorus. Disabled people who came to the park, who saw her, wrote us. We got letter after letter after letter telling us how meaningful it was for them that they saw a quadriplegic person on stage being a part of this show, and how they came to realize through seeing her that they too could do things like be in performances. And it was a big hit, and it ran for 13 years,
wow.
4 times a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
I mean, is that normal? Do the shows usually have that kind of long runs in the parks?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
So normally the shows in the theme parks run for 3 years, and the way Disney decides that they need to be changed out is that people stop going to that show,
right,
because there's no tickets to a particular show. There's just a ticket to the park. And so what they call it is a wear-off curve.
Right.
But people kept coming and coming and coming and coming.
Wow. Had you ever made anything for a theater of that size, a 2,000-seat theater?
Not even close. I mean, the numbers that Disney gets to their parks and to their theaters are extraordinary. We did the 50th anniversary of Disneyland, and I was sitting on Main Street, and I said, I think there are more people that are here for this one event than have seen the work of my entire artistic career. And I said, that makes me really happy and really sad at the same time.
Well, to talk about another Disney show that you worked on.
Yes, next slide, please. I was really, really proud of this show. So I hope, Finding Nemo is a wonderful, wonderful film that was created by Pixar. Yet no Pixar film like Toy Story, Finding Nemo had ever been turned into a musical before. And we brought the composers in that created Frozen. We introduced them to the Disney company, and they wrote a beautiful musical score. The first time the executives heard it, and the person who actually created the film, they literally started to cry. They were so moved. And it was in the animal kingdom, and there were these extraordinary puppets, as you can see, and there was flying and projections. And this was in a 1,300-seat theater in the Animal Kingdom in Florida. And I think it's running to this day. I'm very proud of it. And that was in 2005.
So you spent nearly a decade at Disney, is that right?
Yep, 9 years.
Wow. It sounds perfectly dreamy. But what was it like for you? Because I know you're a rebellious spirit, working inside this giant corporate machine.
Well, it was tough and rewarding. Like when you're a senior executive in any major company, you have a lot of human interaction that can be challenging, and people who don't understand what you're trying to do, and a lot of different people to convince, because being successful in a big company like that, you have to convince the people that run the company, and you have to convince the people that run the parks, and you have to convince the people that are in charge of marketing. There were a lot of people I was convincing all the time. Fortunately, I had hired a team. We had our own little building, and I hired a team of creative and production people that I became so close with. They were like my family. We traveled around the world together, and they were such brilliant people who came from the theater, who learned the parks. And I'm literally close with them and in touch with them to this day.
So I know that after that period, you started to get a little bit antsy, missing New York. But, you know, having given your kids a taste of California living, you felt a draw to return. What in particular were you missing?
Next slide, please. So, yes, I did miss New York, and I really, really missed being able to create theater from the ground up, having my own company as opposed to all these people to convince that I told you about. And so I moved back to New York with my kids, who were by that time in fifth grade, and my husband, who has always been incredibly supportive of my work. And the very first show that we did was a show called Big Outdoor Site Specific Stuff. The picture that you're looking at with grown men and children and baby carriages was a piece that we did in a park, and it was called Moms. I had to start it from scratch. I mean, when I went to California, I really never thought that I would be coming back to New York. And I never could have imagined that. And I think that's something important to remember too, that you may think at any age that you know what the rest of your life is going to look like, but you don't. And you can determine for yourself what change you need to make. Change is scary. But when I'm ready for a change, I always ask myself three things. I ask myself, who am I? What's needed? And how can I make a difference? And I felt like the person that I was needed to come back to New York. And I needed to and wanted to relaunch En Garde Arts so I would have the artistic freedom where I could be developing new work and supporting the artists I believed in. So I started from scratch at 60.
I remember my phone rang. By that time, I was living in London. And I kind of thought at the time that Annie was calling me so that I would talk her out of it. That I would say, don't do this, Annie. Stay with your cushy corporate job in California. And it's too hard to start all this over again. But instead of me convincing her of anything, she convinced me to come back from London and help her with the relaunch, which we did. And it was really amazing fun, actually. I think the second time around, it was a little, well, no, we actually did a lot of really outrageous stuff. The first time I worked with Annie and the second time around too, which we might get to later, but let's stick with the program.
So yeah, I relaunched En Garde Arts, and I've been creating a lot of work that I'm really, really proud of. We're going to talk about a few of those pieces. Next slide, please.
Tell us, Annie, when you start talking about this, I want to know when you got back to New York, if you came back to a city that had changed. You left because it had been changing, and you yourself needed a change. So you returned and found New York, in a different place than you left it. And so how did that impact your vision for the work you wanted to do with En Garde?
Well, funny enough, one of the reasons I went to Disney is because I felt like I could do grand scale shows on Main Street. And I forgot to mention, parades and fireworks shows and nighttime spectacles in lagoons. So a lot of the work that I did was outside theaters, but I also did work inside theaters. And so when I came back, I felt that I really wanted to also do work in theaters as well, that I didn't just want to do outdoor site-specific work, but I wanted to do it indoors as well. And so I had to look around and say, what's possible to do now? What's important about what we need to express at this moment, which is different than what it was 10, 15 years earlier?
At that time, one of the big questions happening in America at that time was about immigration and about problems with America's borders, and a lot of the debate around that was unsophisticated, let's say.
Yeah, and Fandango for Butterflies and Coyotes had an all Latinx team. And I always do work where I feel like it's important to look at the hopeful side of things, because when we think about issues, sometimes we forget there are human beings behind them. And so this was a wonderful show about a group of undocumented immigrants from Latin America that came together to really provide comfort for one another by participating in a fandango. And for those of you who don't know, a fandango is an art form that comes from both Spain and Mexico. And it's a celebration of music and dance that's about playing instruments called jaranas. And there's a small little stage there where they do a form of dance called zapateado that's like a flamenco. And it was a beautiful, beautiful piece. And now I'm going to show you a little brief video about the show. You can play.
It looks positively joyous.
Oh, it's wonderful. And after every show, we brought the audiences out into the streets and we had them dance along with us.
Wow.
And sometimes they were given the jaranas, the instruments, and sang with us. It was really wonderful.
Sounds, I mean, obviously I wasn't in New York for that show, but it sounds really amazing. So, but after Fandango, not too much longer after Fandango, and you had relaunched On Garde Arts, and you were back in the conversation, back captured the city's attention again, and getting great reviews and lots of attention, and then COVID.
Next slide, please. So the city closed down. People weren't going outside. All the theaters were closed. Everyone was very depressed. And I said to myself, girlfriend, you got this. You know how to produce theater outside of theaters. So what are you going to do now? I did 3 different shows during the pandemic. This one was on the street where I live. And all those people that you see on the street were seeing a show that was musical, and there was a wonderful singer and comedian on the steps of my home. And we basically, at the time, there was a law where only 50 people were allowed to gather. And so we had X's on the street. And when we got 50 reservations, we said it was sold out, which was silly in a way, because obviously you can't sell out a street, but people believed us. And then we did 3 shows. The police department cooperated with us, and we closed down the street, and it was a very joyous event.
I mean, it was a nightmare, the whole COVID experience. I mean, New Yorkers having to stay in their apartments, and people not being able to travel, and businesses shuttered. And I remember you telling me about, you thought it was affecting people's dreams, and you wanted to do, explore what people were dreaming about in this moment of, the world closing in on everyone.
Next slide, please. So yes, I was very curious, like what people were dreaming about and thinking about. And I was like, okay, the theaters are closed, but I'm going to do other projects. And so I did a project which I'm very, very proud of, called A Dozen Dreams, with a wonderful designer named Irina Krushelina. I asked a dozen playwrights, what are you dreaming about right now? And it didn't have to be what they were dreaming about when they were sleeping. It could be also when they were awake. And it could be what they dreamed about for the future. And then what we did was we took each dream and we brought it to life in a big, big empty store in a mall. And each dream had its own room that was brought to life with sets, lights, video, and sound. The audience wore headphones. It was COVID safe because they only went in 2 at a time. So they weren't in there with strangers. And they heard the dreams of the playwrights and watched video. And I have a little video for you to get a sense of what A Dozen Dreams was like. So play the video.
The day the world stopped, I dreamt of the ocean, vast, wondrous, beckoning.
What was the response to this show, Annie?
Oh my God, it was sold out before we even had the press hit. And we got this beautiful review from the New York Times, which is the major paper in New York that people pay attention to. We really wanted to move it to another place, but it wasn't built to move. And it really became impossible for us to give it a future life. It ran for 3 weeks and was very, very moving to people.
That's wonderful. It sounds amazing. Did you ever consider trying to adapt it and raise money to, or was that just a thing of the moment?
I mean, we had commercial producers. I don't know if people totally understand the difference with people who will invest in a show, who want to get their money back. That's the way Broadway works. Come to us, and we just couldn't find a space that wasn't too expensive for us to be able to move it and put it in there for 4 or 5 months, which is what we would have needed to do. So it lives on in our memories.
I mean, but that's interesting that, you know, just for me, the point where persisting becomes a decision about practicality. How much more can you chase this to try to make it happen when really, you know, at some point you're just, it's a fool's errand because it just becomes impractical. I mean, which is not to say that so many other ideas that you've had and that we've achieved over the years were absolutely impractical, but we did them anyway.
Look, I probably talked to 20 different real estate developers, and what I found out is that, you know, they just weren't willing to make a commitment. It would have taken us probably a good year to take this down and then rebuild it for another space and make sure we had all the money and get all the marketing done and everything else. And none of them were willing to make a commitment to a space that far ahead of time for a discounted price. And so, but it wasn't like I gave up easily. I never do. I really, really pursued trying to make it happen, but couldn't.
And did that dovetail with the end of the pandemic for you?
No, I actually had one more show that I did, which I'm very proud of. And it was actually a festival that we did in a empty loading dock and a covered arcade and an outdoor plaza where we had 9 different companies performing over 2 weekends. And it was also a very special time. Next slide, please. It was called Downtown Live, and I actually have a little video for you to see that too.
What's
Wonderful.
fascinating about that for me, Annie, and I'm sure, for anybody who, puts it together, seeing people performing and in the audience in masks is how impactful that must have been to everybody who, because there was no work for performers. Everything had shut down and life had come to this ground, it had come to a standstill, a ground to a halt. And you were giving people a chance to do their thing and to have some joy. And, once again, really capturing the zeitgeist of the city in like a way none of us could have ever imagined. I mean, this is really a question of having vision. This is the question of, for me, the way you approach doing this work and responding to, as you said, what is needed. People really needed some collective experience to be, the opportunity to leave their apartments and not just to do something, to go shopping or to get exercise, but to have some joy. And so really kudos to you for doing all that creative work at such an incredibly challenging time. My God.
Let's skip to the next slide, which I'm going to go through quickly. I want to make sure we have time for your questions, everybody. This is a program that we have right now. This is one of the artists we're working with. Right now, what I'm doing is, again, thinking about what's needed and how I can make a difference. And I'm bringing up a whole younger generation of early career artists doing risk-taking work. This artist is doing a new musical. She's a beautiful singer. We don't have time to play that song for you now, but I will tell you the music's gorgeous, and hopefully you'll hear it at another time. And let's flip to the final slide here. When you think about a long career and what makes up a life, I've been producing theater for 38 years. I got married. I'm still married. I have 2 kids. They're now 25. I'm literally turning 70 in August, and I'm still going strong. And when you think about why, it's that I love what I do, and it makes me happy. And I have a purpose. And when you have a purpose, then you can be persistent. And I have to finally say that in no small part, my long-lasting career has been helped and supported by my creative collaborators and supporters and my friends. Friends like Portia, who is my moderator here today. Mm-hmm. Now, let's open it up to your questions.
Okay. So we have lots of questions. Thank you very much, everybody who sent one in. The first one is, Annie, could you share with us a pivotal moment in your career that really defined your path in theater?
That goes way back. So I started off as a sculptor and a performance artist, and I worked with a director named Anne Bogart, who became a lifelong mentor for me. And when I first started doing work, I left the visual arts world and moved into theater because I found visual arts to be a lonely craft, and I'm very collaborative and love people. And I started doing work with Anne as a performer, and Anne started using buildings and streets way back when in the early 80s. And I just said, this is what I want to do. And I want to make a theater so I can do this work throughout my life. But it was about really having this very important mentor whose work I loved and who allowed me to discover as a young artist what my values and passion was.
Okay, next question. What are some of the most significant changes you've seen in the theater industry over the course of your career?
Now that is a whole nother hour. Well, the world has changed. There was, 9/11, which made it so that you can't close off streets like we used to do anymore. I think that theaters in the United States right now are going through a reckoning. a lot of the regional theaters are based on a subscriber model where people buy tickets to a whole season. And that generally tends to appeal to an older audience. And so it's not really working that much anymore. And New York has changed in that it's much, much more expensive to live here than it was when I first came. When I first came to New York, well, you know how old I am, it was in 1975. Literally all the artists lived right closely to one another in inexpensive apartments. And now they're all spread out all over New York City and even in the boroughs. And so it's much harder to feel like one has a sense of community. I also think the support systems feel more difficult today. I mean, things go through phases. I'd say the government support in New York City right now is pretty great, but not nearly enough. And fundraising takes a lot of work and energy, which actually burns some people out. But I try to keep my eye on the things I love.
You have a really good business mind as well as the creative mind. So that's one of the things that is unusual about Annie. I can tell you that. Next question, just so we can make sure we get to all of them. I'm going to motor through. How do you stay inspired and keep your ideas fresh in the constantly evolving world of theater?
Community.
Right.
Friendship. Being there for others. You know, sometimes when I get down, like I do, because I'm human and I have tough days and good days like the rest of us, I know I used to teach, and especially when I was starting off, it was so tough. And I would have a bad day and I would go in and I would teach a class and I would be there for other people. And then I would immediately feel better. I also have learned that by reaching out to people, by doing things like going and having lunch, talking to someone you care about, talking to someone you admire, all of a sudden they'll say something and they'll give you an idea which you never could have thought of before. So I would say the two key words of all of this are community and collaboration.
And you just, as an observer, you've done so much, you've dedicated so much of your professional life to giving people a chance very early on in their career. So they bring a certain freshness just because of their relative inexperience, which is exciting.
You know, to be a little bit personal, I feel like I felt like an outsider when I was a kid growing up.
Mm-hmm.
I had glasses and I wore white socks when they weren't popular. And I think I'm very sensitive to people who also feel like outsiders. A lot of artists are outsiders, really. And I have compassion for them and want to kind of bring them into the fold.
And they very often have something very interesting to say. Okay, can you share an instance where you had to persist with an idea or project even when others doubted it?
How about my whole career? One of the funniest things I remember, though, which was early on, was when I first started off, I was so naive, and I called up a very prestigious museum to ask them if we could do a show in their museum. And I sent them a proposal, and the woman called me back and she said, you know, I have to tell you, we're not on guard, avant-garde, or any other kind of guard. But I think sometimes we go down paths or we go down directions that actually don't make sense or that aren't getting us to where we want to get to. And I have a saying, which I think is very visual, which is, if you're beating your head against the wall, turn around. Because sometimes you do reach a dead end in a way you're thinking. And then you have to say to yourself, why am I reaching this dead end? What can I do differently so that I can get to where I hope to get?
Great. Where did you find all the strength to overcome negativity coming from people?
I'm very Yes, there's a lot of negativity, but as I've said, and I know I'm almost repeating myself, but it is an important theme. Even at Disney, I had a lot of naysayers and people who doubted me, but I had hired this team of people who I grew to love, had incredible respect for, and who had all these great ideas. And when you're not alone and you're with community, when you're with people who believe in the things that you believe in, it gives you greater strength to overcome the people who are being negative. And I also think one last thing is that there are relationships that are toxic. There are artistic relationships that are unhealthy. There are business relationships that are unhealthy. And it's important to protect oneself from that. If you're in a job and you have an abusive boss, quit. If you're working with artists who treat other people poorly, don't keep working with them. So it's also about developing the tools to know how to protect yourself from people who are dysfunctional.
And probably you must know the people who are your best mentors in life, your friends and other people. I mean, I know you well, so I know who some of these people are, who you would turn to when maybe something quite negative might have gotten a little bit under your skin. Someone you could trust to be truthful with you and tell you what you needed to hear, or whether that's being supportive or just speaking hard truths, I guess. Okay. Did you find it easier to convey your message in outdoor activities or indoor, like in theaters, or it doesn't really matter where the action takes place?
There's easy in different ways. So it's easier when you do work outdoors to reach people who don't ordinarily go to the theater, the passerby, the people who live in a nearby building, different communities. We one time did a show where we had kids across the street who lived in housing and they'd never been to a theater piece before at all. And we invited them and they came over and they brought popcorn and they had never seen live theater. When you're indoors, it's obviously easier in that you don't have the elements like weather and rain and people coming up and stealing things. So you don't have that kind of difficulty, but it can become more challenging sometimes to get people who don't go to the theater or rarely go to the theater to come inside.
I remember once when we were doing Another Person is a Foreign Country, directed by Anne Bogart, and there was a gate outside that show that was locked until we opened it up and the audience could come in, and people from the neighborhood would come and watch this rehearsal. And one guy asked me what we were doing, and I said, "We're doing a play." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Why not?" And that was it. Like, that was enough for him to think, okay, all right. And he was one of these people who came upon this and saw this piece of theater in his own neighborhood for the first ever time for him. What are some of the key qualities you believe a successful theater manager or producer should possess?
I'd say great taste. You have to have the ability to identify and work with real talent. I think that's one thing. I think you have to be able to inspire others. You have to be someone who easily can move among people and get them on board. You have to be able to get them to support what you do. And then there are people who run theaters that don't have this quality, but I think it is important. You need to be a human and treat people as you would want to be treated yourself, and be sensitive to things like how much are they getting paid? How many hours are they working? Are they happy? Are there problems in the office? Do you know how to help people navigate communication issues? So it's it's community, and it's building strong interpersonal relationships, both artistically and managerially.
I want to think for a minute about young producers starting now. I mean, considering how much you've learned in your entire career and all the experiences you've had, what would you say to the 20, 23, 25-year-old you coming to any city in any country, anywhere in the world with the dream of making an impact and having a career in the theater? What are the things that you would say are, absolute requirements for a recipe for that career?
I would say the most important thing is to look inside yourself, to think about the stories that are important to you, that you want to tell, and then to think about where you want to tell them, how you want to tell them, and for whom.
And how do you identify for whom? I mean,
Well, it's like,
audience. How do you identify who that audience would be?
well, it's like with Fandango, did we want to have a community from Latin America, a community of undocumented immigrants? Fandango was bilingual. It was both Spanish and English. So we wanted to make sure that it was accessible. So that's for whom.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you to Annie, especially. It was lovely spending this hour with you. And even though we can't see you, whoever is out there watching this now live or later on social media platforms or YouTube, thank you very much for tuning in and for joining us. And mostly of all, thank you to the American Center for inviting us to participate in this. It's really been a pleasure just talking about these memories and all this wonderful work that's been done. And I have to applaud you, Annie, for your persistence and for your friendship and for your creativity and for the incredible contribution you've made, really, to the world of theater and live arts in the United States.
And thank you also for this opportunity. And Portia, thank you for your friendship. And
I'm touched by that.
Thanks.